They called her a traitor, a spy, an Indian lover. And on this moonless night, 30 angry men, drunk on cheap whiskey and their own righteous fury, had come to her isolated cabin in the Black Hills to deliver their own brand of frontier justice. They carried rifles, torches, and a rope. Inside, Amara Vance, a woman who knew more about pressed flowers than she did about hate, pressed her back against the cold stone of her fireplace. She clutched an iron poker, her only weapon against the mob. The heavy wooden door shuddered under the first blow, the sound like a cannon blast in the small room. Splinters rained down. They were coming in. Her life, which had unraveled thread by thread since she left Boston, was about to be torn apart completely. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the final crash. But it never came. Instead, something impossible happened. The screaming, the threats, the pounding, it all just stopped, sliced off, as if by a giant knife. A dead, unnatural silence fell over the clearing, a silence more terrifying than the noise it replaced. Amara opened her eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs. What was happening out there? Because standing between the mob and her cabin, having appeared from the shadows as if they were ghosts made of the night itself, were 5 men. And they were the very savages the town had accused her of helping. How did we get here? How did a quiet botanical illustrator from back east end up in the middle of a war she never wanted? To understand that, you have to understand the place. The Dakota Territory in 1878 wasn't a land of opportunity. It was an open wound. Gold had been found in the Pahasapa, the sacred Black Hills, and the treaty with the Lakota Sioux was now worth less than the paper it was printed on. Towns like Red Creek sprung up overnight, clinging to the sides of canyons like fungus. They were filled with desperate men who'd lost everything chasing a dream, and they needed someone to blame. Their hatred for the Sioux, the people whose land they had just stolen, was a thick, poisonous fog that choked everything. And into this world walked Amara Vance, or Ellie as she preferred. She wasn't looking for gold. She was running. Back in Boston, she was a scandal, the jilted fiancée of a man from a powerful family. Her own family, suffocating in the shame, had given her a small inheritance and a one-way ticket west, hoping the frontier would swallow her, in their humiliation, whole. She didn't mind. She wanted to be forgotten. Her cabin, a mile upstream from the noise and filth of Red Creek, wasn't a home. It was a sanctuary, a laboratory. She wasn't here to tame the land. She was here to document it. She was a botanical illustrator, a woman who found more truth in the delicate veins of a leaf than in all the high society parlors of Boston. Her days were spent in silent communion with the wild, resilient things that grew in this harsh land. The pasque flowers, the wild roses, the lichen clinging to ancient granite. But to survive here, you had to be willfully blind. You had to ignore the simmering rage in town. The men who drank at the Dusty Spur Saloon spoke of the Sioux with a venom that chilled her to the bone. They called them wolves, devils, ghosts. Their stories of raids and scalping grew more gruesome with every shot of whiskey. The ringleader of this chorus of hate was a man named Jebediah Thorne. He was a gaunt, leather-faced prospector who'd found nothing but dirt and blamed the Sioux for it. He'd appointed himself the town's expert on savages. "They ain't human, not really," he'd rasp, his voice cutting through the saloon's haze. "You see one? There's a pack of 'em hiding in the shadows, just waiting to rip the throat out of good Christian folk." Ellie heard these things on her trips for supplies. She'd keep her eyes down, her shopping list clutched in her hand, trying to be invisible. But a single woman, living alone, she was an anomaly, an affront. And in a place like Red Creek, anything different was dangerous. Her only friend, if you could call him that, was Carl, the burly German blacksmith. He respected her because she paid on time and didn't waste his. It was Carl who gave her the first real warning. "Be careful by the creek, Fräulein Vance," he'd said, his hammer striking a glowing horseshoe. "The hills have eyes, and not all of them are the four-legged kind." She knew what he meant. Sometimes, deep in the canyons, she'd feel it, a prickling on the back of her neck, the unnerving sensation of being watched. Once in a while, she'd see him. A lone rider on a distant ridge, silhouetted against the sky. So still he seemed a part of the landscape. A Lakota warrior, the ghost they all feared. The sight filled her with a strange mix of emotions. There was the fear she'd been taught in town for sure, but there was also a deep, aching sorrow for what had been done to these people, and a powerful curiosity. They knew this land. They had names for the plants she drew, names far older than the Latin she used. She was an observer, a cataloger of a world she didn't belong to. She had no idea she was about to be dragged right into its heart. The day it all started was sweltering, a late August afternoon where the air was so thick and still, it felt like you were breathing water. Ellie had ventured further up the canyon than ever before, chasing a rare, star-shaped gentian flower. The creek was just a whisper, a trickle of water sliding over sun-bleached stones. She found a shady spot under some ponderosa pines, pulled out her sketchbook, and lost herself. For hours, the only sounds were the scratching of her pencil on paper and the buzz of insects. The sun began to dip, painting the canyon walls in fiery shades of orange and rose. Then a cool breeze snaked down from the high country. It felt good, a relief from the heat, but it carried a new scent with it, the smell of distant rain, of damp earth. She looked up. To the west, the clear blue sky was gone. In its place was a fortress of bruised, heavy clouds, piling on top of each other, purple and gray, an anvil of a storm, building miles away. That's when a flicker of movement caught her eye. Down by the creek bed. Two boys. They couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. Their black hair was long and unbound, their bodies clad in simple buckskin. They were Lakota, and they were laughing, chasing grasshoppers in the dry wash, completely oblivious. Every warning from Jebediah Thorne screamed in Ellie's mind. They're never alone. It's a trick, a trap. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She froze, hidden by the pines, clutching her sketchbook like a shield. The boys played on, their world consumed by their game. They were brothers, you could tell by their easy rhythm. The older, taller one would point, and the younger one would leap, a whirlwind of joyful energy. The wind picked up, hissing through the pine needles. The light in the canyon was fading fast, swallowed by the monstrous cloud cover now directly overhead. And then she felt it, a low, deep rumble that vibrated up through the soles of her boots. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of the earth itself groaning. Ellie, the botanist, the quiet observer of natural phenomena, knew exactly what it was. She'd read about it in geological surveys. These granite canyons, these dry creek beds, they were perfect funnels. A heavy downpour miles away in the high country could transform a trickle of water into a liquid battering ram in minutes. A flash flood. She looked at the boys, still laughing, still playing in the exact center of a death trap. The distant rumble was getting louder, growing into a steady, menacing roar that was starting to drown out the wind. Fear was a cold, tight knot in her stomach. Fear of the boys, fear of who might be watching from the trees. But a new, more urgent terror was strangling that fear. The terror of watching 2 children die. What should she do? She was an outsider to everyone here. The town scorned her. The Sioux saw her as an invader. Intervening was madness. It was crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. But to do nothing? To sit there in the pines, listening to that approaching roar, and watch those 2 small, laughing boys be erased from the world? That was a different kind of madness. One she knew she couldn't live with. Taking a deep, ragged breath that seared her lungs, Amara Vance made her choice. She stepped out from the cover of the pines. Her voice, when she called out, was a thin, reedy thing against the growing symphony of destruction. "Get out of the creek! Now!" The boys spun around, their game instantly forgotten. Their faces were masks of pure shock and alarm. Not at the sound of the approaching flood, but at her, the white woman, the Wasatchew. They stared, frozen in place by a fear far older and more immediate than any wall of water. To them, she was the monster, a sudden, terrifying apparition from a hostile world. And behind them, the roar was no longer distant. It was here. It was now. For a single horrifying heartbeat, the world was a frozen picture of mutual terror. Ellie saw it in their eyes. They weren't seeing a person. They were seeing a threat. The younger boy, whose name she would later learn was Shante, or Heart, stumbled backward on a loose rock. His older brother, Wanblee, or Eagle, instinctively threw an arm out to shield him, his small face a defiant, panicked scowl. "Run!" Ellie screamed again, her voice raw, shredded by the wind. She didn't just point. She started scrambling toward them, hoping they'd follow her lead. The sound was no longer a rumble. It was a physical force, a grinding, chewing roar that vibrated in her teeth and bones. The ground trembled. Pebbles danced on the rocks around her. But the boys didn't move. They were paralyzed by a lifetime of warnings from their elders about the white people who took everything. There was no more time for words, no time for anything. Ellie closed the distance in a desperate sprint. She grabbed Wanblee's arm. The boy flinched as if he'd been burned, trying to wrench himself free. His eyes were wide with the shock of her touch. "Nahan, Nahan!" he yelled, a Lakota word for no that needed no translation. "I'm sorry," she gasped, her grip tightening like a vice. She was stronger than she looked, her arms wiry from years of hiking. She half dragged, half pushed him toward the steep, crumbling side of the ravine. Shante, seeing his brother being manhandled by this strange woman, let out a cry of distress. But driven by the instinct to stay with his sibling, he scrambled after them. And then it came. The first tongue of the flood appeared around the canyon bend. It wasn't water. It was a churning brown wall of mud, tree limbs, and rocks, moving with the speed of a freight train. It was a liquid beast, and the sound it made was the sound of the world being torn apart. They had seconds. Mere seconds. The canyon wall was a treacherous slope of loose scree and thorny bushes. There was no path. Ellie shoved Wanblee toward a thick root snaking out from the earth. "Climb!" For the first time, a flicker of understanding crossed the boy's face. He turned his head and saw the monstrous wave. The fear of her was instantly vaporized by the primal terror of the flood. He didn't need any more encouragement. He clawed at the dirt, his small hands finding purchase, and started scrambling upward. Ellie turned and scooped up Shante. He was light but squirming with panic. She practically threw him onto the slope above her, pushing him from behind. "Go! Follow your brother!" She scrambled after them, her leather shoes slipping on the loose gravel, her lungs burning. Her sketchbook and pencils, her last connection to her old safe life, lay forgotten in the path of the deluge. A thorny branch ripped a long, bleeding gash down her forearm, but she barely felt it. All that mattered was the climb. The wall of water hit the place where they had been standing with a concussive boom that shook the very bedrock. The sound was deafening. A spray of muddy water, cold as ice, shot up, drenching them. Shante screamed as the current lashed at his legs. Ellie, positioned just below him, felt the powerful suction try to pull her back down into the chaos. She dug her fingers into the soil, her nails breaking, and held on, shielding the boy's small body with her own. The torrent was a horrifying spectacle. It was 10 feet high, a roiling mass of destruction. Entire trees, ripped from the earth, tumbled end over end like matchsticks. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and shattered pine. They climbed. It was a desperate, animalistic scramble for their lives. Wanblee, agile and terrified, led the way. Ellie stayed below Shante, constantly pushing him upward, her voice a series of short, sharp commands. "Keep going. Almost there. Don't look down." Her muscles screamed in protest. The gash on her arm throbbed, warm blood mixing with the cold mud. Finally, Wanblee found it. A narrow ledge, barely 2 feet wide, protected by a granite overhang. It wasn't much, but it was 20 feet above the raging torrent. He hauled himself onto it, then immediately turned, his face pale with shock, and reached down for his brother. Ellie gave Shante one last mighty shove. Wanblee grabbed his hand and managed to pull the smaller boy to safety. Now it was her turn. She was utterly exhausted, her arms trembling with a fatigue so deep it felt like it was in her bones. She reached for the ledge, her muddy fingers finding a crack in the rock. As she tried to pull herself up, her foot slipped on a wet patch of scree. For one terrifying second, she dangled, her entire body weight held by one hand. Her grip began to fail. She saw the churning chaos below, a maelstrom that would swallow her whole and leave no trace. This is it, she thought. a strange, horrifying calm washing over her. This is where the scandal from Boston ends. Then a small but surprisingly strong hand clamped down on her wrist. She looked up. Wambly was lying on his stomach, his face inches from hers, his expression one of fierce, terrified concentration. He had her, and behind him, Shante had his small hands wrapped around his brother's waist, anchoring him. They were saving her. A fresh surge of adrenaline coursed through her. Ellie found a new foothold, kicked against the rock face, and with the boys pulling with all their might, she flopped onto the ledge, gasping for air, her body a wreck of trembling muscles and raw nerves. They lay there for a long time, three figures huddled on a tiny rock shelf, listening to the symphony of destruction below. The flood raged for what felt like an eternity. The sun set, and a cold, miserable rain began to fall, plastering their hair to their faces and chilling them to the bone. Ellie shivered, not just from the cold, but from the aftershocks of terror. She looked at the boys. They were huddled together, their eyes wide and dark, fixed on the churning water. The defiance was gone, replaced by a profound, childlike shock. Shante was shaking uncontrollably, his teeth chattering. Acting on pure instinct, Ellie shifted, positioning herself to block the worst of the wind-driven rain. She drew them closer, pulling them into the folds of her wet, muddy skirt and jacket. At first they were stiff, their bodies rigid with the ingrained mistrust of her. But the cold was a more powerful force than conditioning. Slowly, tentatively, they leaned into her warmth. She wrapped her arms around them, the three of them becoming a single shivering unit against the storm. She felt Shantae's small body relax, his shivering subsiding slightly as he absorbed her body heat. Wambly remained tense for longer, a silent, proud sentinel. But eventually he too succumbed to exhaustion and cold, resting his head against her shoulder. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her arm. They didn't speak. There were no words that could bridge the chasm between their worlds. There was only the shared, grim reality of survival. The cold, the wet, the roar of the water, and the fragile, unexpected warmth of three bodies huddled together as darkness consumed the canyon. Ellie held the two Sioux boys, the sons of her supposed enemies, and felt a profound and aching sense of connection she had never known in the parlors of Boston or the suspicious streets of Red Creek. She was no longer just an observer. The debt between them was already more complicated than she could ever have imagined, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the rain, that the flood was only the beginning of the storm. The night was a long, cold purgatory. The roar of the water eventually subsided to a deep, gurgling growl. The rain eased to a miserable drizzle. Sleep was impossible. Huddled on the ledge, every snap of a twig, every gust of wind sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Ellie's exhausted body. Dawn broke, not with color, but with a slow, gray dilution of the darkness, revealing a world of profound devastation. The canyon floor was unrecognizable, a wasteland of glistening mud, uprooted trees, and freshly carved channels. Her small camp, her sketchbook, her satchel of drawing tools, all gone, swallowed by the flood. As the light grew, Wambly stirred. He sat up, his movements stiff, and surveyed the damage. His face was grim, the face of a child forced into premature adulthood. He looked at Ellie, his dark eyes unreadable. The fear was gone, replaced by something else, a deep, assessing curiosity. He said nothing, but a silent question hung in the air between them. A sound from the canyon rim above made them all freeze. It was the sharp, clear call of a hawk. But it was answered from the other side of the canyon, a signal. Wambly's head snapped up. A look of immense relief washed over his face. He stood on the precarious ledge and let out an answering call, a surprisingly powerful cry from such a small body. A few moments later, a figure appeared on the ridge directly above them, silhouetted against the pale morning sky. He was tall and lean, with the powerful build of a man who lived a hard life. He moved with a liquid grace even on the treacherous, muddy ground. Even from a distance, Ellie could feel the intensity of his presence. This was no boy. This was a warrior. As he drew closer, she saw the sharp planes of his face, the long, unbound black hair, and the fierce, protective fury in his eyes. "Shantae! Wan Blee!" His voice boomed, filled with a desperate relief that echoed in the ruined canyon. He half slid, half climbed down the steep embankment to their ledge. The boys scrambled to meet him, throwing their arms around his waist, their composure finally breaking. They spoke in a rapid torrent of Lakota, their voices overlapping, filled with the terror and relief of their ordeal. The warrior held them tight, his eyes closed, his face a mask of profound gratitude. Then as he listened to their story, his eyes opened, and they fell on Ellie. The warmth in his expression vanished, replaced by a wall of ice. It was a look she had seen before, in the faces of the men in Red Creek. Only this was its mirror image. The same hatred, the same suspicion, born of the same history of violence and mistrust, just pointed in the opposite direction. His hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt. He saw a white woman, disheveled and muddy, with his brothers. His mind, conditioned by years of conflict, leaped to the most logical, most terrible conclusion. She was responsible. This was an ambush. This was a trap. Wanblee, seeing the murderous look on his older brother's face, pulled away from his embrace. He stepped forward, placing his small body between the warrior and Ellie. A human shield. "Luda," he said, his voice firm. "Brother." He pointed a small muddy finger at Ellie. Then he pointed to the dry wash where they had played, to the high ledge where they now stood, to the gash on Ellie's arm. He began speaking with an earnestness that was impossible to doubt, his words tumbling out, recounting the entire story. Shantae nodded vigorously, adding his own small details. Ellie stood frozen, watching the warrior's face. His name, she would later learn, was Tashunka Luta. Red Horse. As he listened to his younger brothers, his expression shifted through a kaleidoscope of emotions. The initial fury gave way to confusion, then to a grudging disbelief, and finally to something complex and unreadable. He looked from his brothers' earnest faces to Ellie's exhausted, mud-streaked form. He looked at the devastation around them, the undeniable evidence of the flood's power. The story, as impossible as it seemed, fit the facts. He had come prepared for a fight, for a rescue, or for a grim recovery. He was not prepared for this. He was not prepared for a debt. His gaze lingered on the bloodied tear in her sleeve. He took a hesitant step forward and spoke, not to her, but to the air in front of her. His English was slow, deliberate, each word carved from stone. "You pulled them from water." Ellie found her voice, though it was hoarse. There wasn't time to do anything else. Red Horse stared at her, his mind grappling with a new, world-shattering reality. The Wasatchu were invaders, treaty breakers, killers. They were a monolithic force of destruction. But this one woman, this solitary figure, had risked her own life to save two Lakota children. It was a fact that did not compute. It broke the simple, brutal arithmetic of his world. He gave a curt, sharp nod. It was not thanks. It was an acknowledgement, a confirmation of a fact that now existed between them. Then he turned his back to her, speaking softly to his brothers in Lakota, checking them for injuries. Without another word or glance at Ellie, he began the difficult process of getting his siblings back up to the canyon rim. Ellie was left alone on the ledge, the adrenaline that had sustained her finally draining away, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. The warrior and his brothers vanished over the ridge. She was alone again. But everything had changed. She had saved two lives, but she had the terrifying feeling she had just ruined her own. Getting back to her cabin was an ordeal. She had to navigate the treacherous, mud-slicked canyon floor, forcing her aching body on the 2-mile trek. When she finally stumbled through her own doorway, she was a ghost of herself. She cleaned and bandaged the gash on her arm, collapsed onto her cot, and spiraled into a gray haze of fatigue. When she awoke, it was late afternoon. Her body ached, but her mind was clear, and a terrible thought began to dawn on her. The tracks, the evidence of what happened. They wouldn't see a rescue. They would only see that she had been with the Sioux. In the eyes of Red Creek, her crime was not just trespassing, it was treason. Her fears were confirmed 2 days later. The moment she stepped onto the town's boardwalk for supplies, she felt the change. The usual whispers and curious stares were replaced by something harder, more hostile. Jebediah Thorne and his cronies were standing outside the general store. As she approached, Thorne spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed dangerously close to her skirt hem. "Well, well," he sneered, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "If it ain't the Indian lover, heard you was down by the creek, getting real friendly with some of Red Horse's whelps." Ellie's blood ran cold. How could he possibly know? "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice tight. "Oh, I think you do," Thorne shot back. "We seen the tracks down in the wash. 3 sets, one of them wearing delicate little ladies' shoes. You think we're stupid? They're getting bolder, coming right into the valley. And they got help from traders right here in this town." His eyes were small, hard points of pure malice. Ellie grabbed her supplies, her hands trembling. The storekeeper refused to meet her eye. She fled, the walk back to her cabin a gauntlet of hostile stares. She was no longer just an oddity. She was a pariah, an enemy. That night, a rock crashed through her window. Meanwhile, in a hidden camp deep in the hills, Red Horse was wrestling with a crisis of conscience. He owed this woman a debt. It was not a matter of choice. It was a fundamental law of his culture. A life saved had to be acknowledged. To ignore it would bring shame not just upon him, but upon his family. It would be a disharmonious act, an offense against the spirits. But how could he repay a debt to a white woman? To approach her was to risk being seen, to invite violence upon himself and his people. To give her a gift would be misunderstood, seen as payment for a spy. His actions had to be precise, meaningful, and secret. He consulted an elder of his band, a wise, wrinkle-faced man named Chayton, or Falcon. Chayton listened to the story in silence, his eyes closed as if watching it unfold in his mind. When Red Horse had finished, he spoke softly. "The water does not choose who it drowns. It is a power of the world. This woman stood against that power for our children. The debt is not to a Washoe. It is a debt to the spirit that moved through her. It must be honored." Chayton's words settled the conflict in Red Horse's soul. He knew what he had to do. It would be dangerous. It would be misunderstood by both sides. But it was the only way. A week after the flood, Ellie was sitting in her cabin at dusk. The shattered window was boarded up, a constant reminder of her new reality. She was trying to concentrate on a new drawing, but every sound from outside made her jump. Then she heard it, a single, soft footstep. Not the heavy, clumsy tread of a townsman, but something light, deliberate, almost silent. Her heart leaped into her throat. Thorne. He'd come to make good on his threats. She grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace, her knuckles white. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer, only silence. Then a low voice, the same one she'd heard in the canyon, spoke through the wooden door. "The woman who is not afraid of water." It was Red Horse. Ellie's fear was instantly replaced by a profound confusion. What did he want? Why was he here? This was insane. If he was seen, they would both be killed. She slowly unbarred the door and opened it, just a crack. He was standing there, alone, bathed in the deep purple light of twilight. He held no weapon. In his hands he carried a small, beautifully beaded pouch. He didn't try to enter. He simply stood on her doorstep, his presence filling the small clearing. "My brothers are safe," he said, his gaze direct and unnervingly intense. "They are warm. They laugh again. This is because of you." Ellie was speechless. I'm glad they're all right. A life for a life is the way of the warrior," he continued, his voice low and steady. "I cannot give you a life, but my family owes you, my people. They do not understand this. They see only the color of your skin." He paused, choosing his words with immense care. "But I see what you did. An honorable action must have an honorable name." He took a single step forward and held out the small pouch. "In our way, we give thanks. A wopila. This is a small thing, but we also give a name to mark what a person is." He looked at her, his eyes locking onto hers, and in that moment she felt as if he could see straight into her soul. "You were not a sister, not a mother. You were a stranger, but you stood up. You lifted my brothers from the darkness of the water. So I will call you Miwakamanyan Wanjila. He said the Lakota words slowly, letting them hang in the still air. Miwakamanyan Wanjila, he repeated. It means the one who lifts up. It is your name now. My family will know you by it. The spirits will know you by it. He placed the beaded pouch on her doorstep, then turned, and as silently as he had appeared, he melted back into the shadows and was gone. Ellie stood in the doorway, the poker hanging forgotten in her hand. She picked up the pouch. It was filled with dried herbs, sweetgrass, and sage, their scent filling the cool night air. She looked out into the empty darkness where he had been. She had been ostracized by her own people for a crime she didn't commit, only to be given the highest of honors by the very people she was supposed to hate. Miwakaanyan Wanjila, the one who lifts up. Tears streamed down her face. Tears of fear, of relief, of a profound and shattering loneliness. The name was a gift, a secret shield, but it was also a brand, one that marked her as belonging to neither world and set her on a collision course with the hatred that was brewing in Red Creek. The debt had been acknowledged, but the payment, she was beginning to realize, was far from complete. The name, Miwakanyan Wanjala, settled into Ellie's soul like a stone in a deep pool. It was a secret she kept locked away, a flicker of warmth in a world that was rapidly turning hostile. She would say it to herself in the quiet of her cabin, the Lakota syllables of foreign yet intimate comfort. It was a reminder that in one corner of this vast, harsh land, she was not a pariah, but a person of honor. It was this secret strength she drew upon as the walls of Red Creek's animosity closed in. Jebediah Thorne, having found a scapegoat for the town's collective failures and fears, did not let up. He nurtured the seed of suspicion he had planted, watering it with daily doses of rumor and vitriol, until it grew into a thick, thorny vine of open hatred that ensnared the entire community. Ellie's existence shrank. Her weekly trips for supplies became a calculated exercise in quiet endurance. The moment her boots touched the dusty main street, a palpable silence would fall. Conversations would halt mid-sentence. At the general store, Mrs. Gable, a woman who had once traded tips on preserving peaches, now served her with brisk, cold efficiency, slapping her goods on the counter as if they were contaminated. Thorne and his acolytes were a constant presence, a gauntlet she had to pass. They would lounge on the saloon porch, chairs tilted back, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Their taunts grew bolder. "Best watch your scalp, boys," Thorne would call out, his voice a malicious drawl that carried across the street. The pretty little traitor might be telling her friends which ones to take first. Cruel laughter would follow, echoing in Ellie's ears long after she had fled. The threats soon bled out from the town and into the sanctity of her home. One morning she discovered her small, meticulously tended vegetable garden had been savaged. Vines ripped from the earth, carrots and potatoes uprooted and scattered. It was a petty, vicious act of destruction that felt deeply personal. It was an attack not just on her sustenance, but on her hope. Fear became her constant companion. She began to sleep with the heavy iron poker resting against her cot. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind sent a jolt of ice through her veins. She considered leaving. The thought was a tempting whisper in her darkest moments. She could pack her few belongings and take the stagecoach back east, back to a life of polite shame that was, at the very least, safe. But something held her back. It was more than just stubbornness. It was the name, the one who lifts up. To run would be to betray that name. It would be an admission of the guilt they had assigned her, a final victory for Thorne's poisonous lies. And so, with a resolve that surprised even herself, she stayed. The breaking point came on a moonless night in late September. A freight wagon had delivered a fresh supply of whiskey to Red Creek, and the Dusty Spur Saloon was overflowing with a potent, volatile combination of cheap liquor and simmering resentment. Thorne saw his chance. He climbed onto a rickety table, his gaunt frame casting a long, distorted shadow in the flickering lantern light. "For weeks we've been watching," he slurred, his voice rising above the din. The saloon grew quiet. That woman up the creek. She's a spy, I tell you. You noticed how quiet it's been? Red Horse and his butchers, they ain't been seen for a month. You know why? He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a feverish intensity. They're planning something. They're massing in the hills, getting ready to strike. And she is their eyes and ears. A murmur of drunken, fearful agreement rippled through the crowd. Are we going to wait? Thorne roared, raising a fist. Are we going to sit here drinking while they sharpen their knives? Wait for them to come in the night and burn our homes? Or are we going to go up there and get some answers? Show her what we do with traitors. He had them. The raw fear, stoked by whiskey and ignorance, had finally boiled over. A mob was born. Men grabbed lanterns, rifles, even farm implements. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering, unsteady light, were twisted with an ugly, righteous fury. They were no longer prospectors or farmers. They were a tide of vengeance, and they began their clumsy, angry march up the creek toward Ellie's cabin. Carl the blacksmith watched them go with a sick feeling in his stomach. He knew this was wrong, but to stand against the mob was to become its next target. He stayed put, the taste of his beer turning to ash in his mouth. Inside her cabin, Ellie heard them coming, a low murmur of distant, angry shouts that grew louder, blending with the frantic thumping of her own heart. She rushed to the window and saw it, a swarm of bobbing lights like angry fireflies weaving through the trees, coming directly for her. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She scrambled to the door, her hands shaking so violently she could barely slide the thick wooden beam into its iron brackets. She backed away, clutching the poker, her back pressed against the cold stone of the fireplace. The shouts were just outside now, a cacophony of slurred threats. Come on out, traitor! We know you're in there, squaw lover! A heavy rock slammed against the door with a deafening boom, making the whole cabin shake. The wood splintered. They were going to break it down. Ellie squeezed her eyes shut, a desperate, silent prayer catching in her throat. And then, silence. Sudden, shocking, complete. Ellie opened her eyes, her brow furrowed. The silence was in its own way more terrifying than the noise. It was the silence of a predator's arrival. Outside, the mob had frozen. The men at the front had stopped dead in their tracks, causing those behind to stumble into a bewildered, shuffling pile. Their drunken courage evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sober terror that chilled them to the bone. Standing between them and Ellie's cabin, arranged in a silent crescent line, were 5 figures. They had materialized from the moonless darkness as if born from the shadows themselves. They were on foot, armed with bows and war clubs, their forms radiating a calm, lethal stillness. At their center, tall and immovable as a mountain pine, was Tashunka Luta, Red Horse. What the mob didn't know was that Shantae, the younger brother, had taken to watching Ellie's cabin from the distant hills, a self-appointed guardian, repaying a debt in his own way. He had seen the torches forming in town and had run faster than he had ever run in his life to warn his older brother. Red Horse and his warriors had not come to attack Red Creek. They had come to defend one small cabin. Jebediah Thorne stood at the head of the mob, his rifle half raised. The sight of Red Horse, the very devil from all his stories, standing as a protector for the woman he'd accused, was a shock that momentarily scrambled his brain. What is this? Thorne stammered, his booming authority gone. This is town business. You have no right. Red Horse took a single deliberate step forward. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words, spoken in clear, measured English, cut through the night with absolute authority. This woman is Miwak Anyan Wanjila, he said, speaking the Lakota name like a shield, a declaration. She is under the protection of my family. Her honor is my honor. You will not touch her. He let the words sink into the stunned silence. He was not threatening a raid. He was not declaring war. He was stating a fact, a law of honor that the drunken mob, in their own crude way, could understand. He had come not to destroy them, but to stop them from destroying themselves with their own hatred. It was an inverted siege. The so-called savages were protecting a white woman from the savagery of so-called civilized men. She "She's a witch," one of the men stammered. "She's bewitched you." Red Horse's gaze fell upon him, calm and heavy, and the man shrank back as if physically struck. "She is a woman who pulled my brothers from a flood while you hid in your wooden houses, afraid of the rain," Red Horse said, his voice quiet but carrying to every man present. He paused, letting them absorb the shame of his words. "Who here has more honor?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, from the back of the crowd, a voice boomed with the authority of hammered steel. "That's enough, Jebediah." It was Carl, the blacksmith. His conscience had won. He pushed his way to the front, his broad shoulders clearing a path. "He's right. This is madness. Go home." Carl's intervention broke the spell. He was one of them. His words gave them permission to retreat without completely losing face. The men, their drunken courage gone, their righteous fury revealed as the ugly thing it was, began to look at each other with shame. They lowered their rifles. They mumbled apologies to no one in particular and began to drift away in twos and threes until only Jebediah Thorne was left, standing alone, exposed and pathetic. He gave Red Horse a look of pure, undiluted hatred, then turned and slunk back into the darkness. Red Horse watched until the last light was gone. Then he turned his head and looked at the cabin door. Ellie, who had watched the entire impossible scene through a crack in the shutter, slowly unbarred the door and stepped outside. She looked at Red Horse, her heart too full for words. He had repaid his debt, not with a gift, but with his life, with his honor. He had stood against her people to protect her. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of a debt paid in full, of a circle closed. Then, as silently as they had arrived, he and his warriors turned and vanished back into the trees, leaving Amara Vance standing safe in the sudden, peaceful quiet of the night. She never saw Red Horse again, but the story of that night became a reluctant legend in Red Creek. Jebediah Thorne lost all credibility, becoming a bitter, ignored old man. And Ellie Vance was no longer a pariah. She was treated with a new, grudging, and fearful respect. She was the woman the Sioux had protected. She stayed in her cabin for many more years, a quiet fixture of the landscape, forever living between two worlds, bound by a name spoken in a language she would never learn, but whose meaning she understood with every fiber of her being. She was the one who lifts up. This story is a powerful reminder that history is never simple. In a world defined by conflict, an act of courage created an obligation, and a debt of honor proved more binding than any treaty. It shows that true strength isn't found in hatred, but in the rare, difficult choice to see the humanity in someone you've been taught to despise. If you found this story of courage and honor powerful, do me a favor and hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates the complex, true history of the American West. And for more stories that uncover the hidden corners of the past, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss a thing. Thanks for listening.